Assessing pragmatic communication in children with Down syndrome. So before going into the study, I just want to give a brief overview on what exactly Down syndrome is. So individuals with Down syndrome, they have greater difficulty with expressive language than receptive language, meaning they do have stronger receptive language. It's a developmental disability, and it is the most prevalent worldwide, where 1 in 737 births are affected. So the purpose of this study is to explore the nature of pragmatic communication in children with Down syndrome. The primary aim is to determine the extent of any impairment or strengths in areas of pragmatic communication. The secondary aim is to explore various potential correlates of pragmatic communication in children with Down syndrome. So successful communication depends on language, content, form, and use. So without one of them, all of the other one will be, or with one of them impaired, the other ones will be affected as well. So you see how they all overlap each other. So now if form is taken out, content and use will also be affected. So this method, the study's method, they used 29 6-year-old children with Down syndrome. 16 of them were females and 13 were males. Personally, I liked how they found all children in the exact 6-year-old age, and the 16 and 13, the sex difference was very close. So I find that this is going to help strengthen the validity of this study. Only those who were able to speak in sentences were also included in this study. So they had a strong inclusive criteria. So they used the Children's Communication Checklist 2, the CCC2. The participants were assessed in initiation, scripted language, understanding context, and nonverbal communication. The relationship between pragmatics and measures of vocabulary, nonverbal mental ability, and social functioning were also explored. All of the children, like I said, are school-age children. The nonverbal communication was expected to be the strongest area of pragmatics, while understanding context was expected to be weaker. The CCC2 requires that children can use multi-word utterances. So the inclusion criteria. Participants had no comorbid diagnosis such as autism, and that also helps strengthen the validity because, as we know, children with autism, that will have a different outcome. If we're working with children with autism and children without autism, we will have different results. All of the participants spoke Norwegian as a first language, and they were all the same age, which was 6 years old. Just a little background, a little overview. So this took place it's a Norwegian study, and in Norwegian schools they place children with Down syndrome in mainstream classes. So it's it's an inclusive culture where we have like private, separate special education classes for individuals with Down syndrome. So data collection, how do they collect data? So this study collected data by parent electronic questionnaires and clinical tests. The clinical tests were individually in private rooms, and they were videotaped. They used the expressive picture naming test, the WIPSI, and the British picture vocabulary test. The British picture vocabulary test, we could compare it to the Peabody picture vocabulary test, just so it's a good comparison. The parent electronic questionnaires were the CCC2 checklist, the pediatric evaluation of disability inventory, and the strengths and difficulty questionnaire. So the parents had to fill out the strengths and difficulties of their children, because obviously this is all individualized. So the measurements. To measure the study, they used the checklist because that was a standardized assessment in the UK. It is a standardized assessment in the UK, and it assesses general communication disorder, social interaction, deviance difficulties, pragmatic communication, and there were 70 questions where the parent would rate the child on their speech, their syntax, their semantics, as well as their coherence. So, in order to measure the receptive vocabulary test, they used the British Picture Vocabulary Scale, where the participants were presented with 4 images and they had to point to the corresponding image based on what the examiner verbalized. The expressive vocabulary test was measured using the standardized picture naming test, the WIPSI, where children were presented with a sequence of pictures and they were asked to name them. Social functioning was measured, the PETI, which is a standardized assessment, the comprehension of word meaning, comprehension of sentence meaning, as well as functional use of communication. They were also measured on how they problem solve and their social interactive play. So the results. So children with Down syndrome have various strengths and weaknesses, as we know. Based on this study, the outcomes concluded that the nonverbal communication was strong in individuals with Down syndrome. However, understanding context was poor. So with this being said, we should always break down everything that we are saying, even though I feel like many people do that subconsciously in communicating with individuals with Down syndrome, just due to their poor understanding. It is always good and beneficial to break down everything that is being said. So this study highlights the importance to teach pragmatics to individuals with Down syndrome. And I like how this study really highlighted that importance because many people, I feel like pragmatic especially, many people kind of pass through that and focus on just the speech and the language and the content of the vocabulary being produced mostly. So I really enjoyed and I liked how this study had such a strong and inclusive criteria. I think a future study could focus and really work with individuals from America and compare would the results be the same, being that individuals with Down syndrome are kind of separated from their peers here in America, because here in this Norwegian study, these Down syndrome children are constantly integrated with mainstream kids, whereas that might impact their overall performance. So that could be a great future study. So thank you so much.